This video is going to continue our investigation of avian anatomy and physiology, and we're going to really focus on some of the aspects of physiology and anatomy that center around metabolism. So we talked last time about the importance of respiration, getting oxygen to tissue because aerobic metabolism requires oxygen, and then also getting that to the tissue via the circulatory system. So we have to have a very efficient method of moving blood. And then one of the waste products associated with metabolism is nitrogenous waste. And so we'll talk about the excretory system and how we use that to get rid of those toxic wastes. Well, let's first talk about respiration. Birds, as I mentioned previously, typically breathe through their nares, so through their nose. They don't typically breathe through the mouth. That's usually a sign that they're heat stressed. Now, sometimes associated with the nostrils is an operculum or a flap-like valve that they can close that off when they want to, or reduce the size of that opening. And this is going to be important when we talk about both heat retention but also water loss in birds. And then also a cere is a fleshy structure seen here in the pigeon that can change in size and accomplish the same thing as the operculum. As I mentioned, mouth breathing is something that indicates that a bird is heat stressed, so the gular fluttering that we talked about both raises metabolism when a bird is trying to get rid of heat, as we mentioned, but we're going to see it also has a cost associated with water loss. So some of the things that birds do to conserve water is have highly vascularized, highly coiled terminate chambers called nasal concha. What this high surface area, highly vascularized surface allows is water conservation. So outgoing air is going to be very warm at first, and that allows it to absorb lots of water. So it'll be very humid air. But as they breathe out, the heat is transferred back into the body through the nasal concha, and the air cools, and as it cools, it deposits some of its water into the nasal concha. This then allows incoming relatively dry air to resorb this moisture that's in the nostrils as it warms up. The nasal conchas also are associated with some olfaction abilities, but this varies greatly in birds. So some birds like turkey vultures, petrels have really good sense of smell. Most birds, we think, don't have much of a sense of smell. We'll talk about that later in more detail. So once the air gets in through the concha, then it goes through a choana, which is a slit-like control in the upper palate. And this is just one of the valve-like structures that allows birds to control the amount of air going into the respiratory system. Once the air passes through the choana, it enters the pharynx. And so the pharynx is a common passageway for both air and food and water. Air then goes through the larynx. So the larynx is a mechanism going from the pharynx. It allows for controlled passage of air into the trachea, which is going to lead to the lungs. Now the valve in this case that provides that access is called the glottis. And here we see the side of the larynx in a bird, and the glottis would be a slit-like valve shown in this location. Important to realize, though, that the larynx, while it is responsible for vocalization in mammals, does not serve that purpose in birds. We'll see that there's another structure associated with vocalizations in birds. Once the air then leaves the larynx, it enters the trachea. And the trachea is a long hose-like structure with cartilaginous rings to keep it from collapsing, so it's kind of like a vacuum cleaner hose. And again, its main function is just to transport the air to the lungs. However, the length of this can vary in some birds and can be very long and wrapped around and provide some extra resonance for vocalizations. So think of kind of like a French horn with its curves and how that adds the resonance for that musical instrument. Near the base of the trachea, but the exact position does vary from bird group to bird group, is a structure called the syrinx. And the syrinx is the sound production organ in birds. Sound is produced as air moves across the tympaniform membranes, and there are two of these. one on each side. And in some cases, birds can actually make two different sounds using each tympaniform membrane on each side simultaneously. So they can make different sounds that can complement each other or add some complexity to a vocalization. Now, what we're going to find, though, is that the extent of the musculature associated with the syrinx varies greatly among birds, and in some birds that don't have much in the way of vocalizations, like an oil bird here, a caprimulgiform, most of the non-passerines have relatively simple syringeal morphology, and they are capable of relatively simple vocalizations. Some actually no vocalizations, like, say, a vulture. However, there are some non-passerines, like parrots, psittaciforms, which are capable of some amazing vocal abilities. And then something like a canary, which is a songbird, a passerine, has really some pretty complex musculature and really are some of the best singers. That's one characteristic of passerines. The lungs of birds is quite different from the lungs of mammals. These lungs in birds are non-inflatable. They're a relatively dense system of tubes within tubes. So the bronchi, which split from the trachea after leaving the syrinx, split into smaller and smaller branches as they enter the lung complex. Finally, they end up into very tiny structures called parabronchi, and this is where most of the gas exchange occurs, as seen here. The structure of the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins associated with a parabronchus is such that it allows for a countercurrent exchange of gases. So we talked about countercurrent exchange system in a thermal capacity so that there's more efficient transfer of heat from arteries to veins. Here we're talking about a situation of more efficient transfer of oxygen, such that as the airflow passes through these air vessels that are in the parabronchi, it is running counter to the blood flow in the arteries, so that there's more efficient exchange and increase in oxygen going into the artery and an increase in concentrations of CO2 going back into the air vessel so it can be discharged from the body. And this is a one-way system of airflow vessels. There are no dead-end alveoli as we see in mammals. And this one-way flow of air lends to a much greater efficiency of absorbing oxygen and getting rid of CO2 as we see in birds compared to mammals. And this has allowed birds to do some pretty remarkable things. So bar-headed geese can fly at some incredibly high altitudes and for very long distances. They actually fly over the Himalayan mountains during their migration, which is an area of very rarefied air. It's not something any mammal could accomplish. Well, one of the things that any respiratory system is going to need is movement of air across the respiratory surfaces. And in mammals, that's accomplished using a diaphragm, but birds don't have a diaphragm. What they do instead, inhalation, is due to movements of the thoracic cavity itself. So muscles that drop the sternum will increase will create a vacuum that draws air into the lungs and the air sacs. And I just mentioned a structure that is very important for this one-way potential flow of air through the respiratory system. Birds, in addition to their lungs, have a series of air sacs. We mentioned this previously when we talked about the skeletal system. They actually extend into the long bones of birds. And what these air sacs do is allow for storage. In one case, it can store CO2 before it can be exhaled from the body, and in other air sacs, it's storing highly oxygenated air before it actually moves into the lungs. Now, to accomplish this, one breath of air takes actually 2 respiratory cycles to make it completely through the system. All right, well, let's track a breath of air and understand why it takes 2 inhalations and exhalations for that breath of air to make it through the system. So I'm using a diagram from an older book to demonstrate this because the diagram in your book doesn't quite show it accurately, so please don't follow that. So the first thing that you want to do is bring air into the body. That's what we call inhalation 1. So you're breathing in and air goes directly to the posterior air sacs. Now, the only thing I don't like about this diagram is it looks like this bird is breathing out its chest And that's just for simplicity. Remember, this white line is actually would go to the nares, through the bronchi and trachea and so forth. In expiration 1, or the first exhalation, muscles cause the posterior air sacs to contract, forcing that highly oxygenated air that was just brought into the body from the previous inhalation into the lungs. And this is the most important phase that I want you to know, because this is where gas exchange takes place. We have fully oxygenated air moving through the lungs, transferring that oxygen to the blood vessels. So this may seem a little counterintuitive at first. This expiration, this exhalation, is when birds are actually getting their gas exchange taking place. Well, why does it take 2 cycles? Why wasn't that 1 cycle enough? Well, now we have to have our second inhalation, and at this point, the air that was in the lungs now moves to the anterior air sacs. Now realize, when this is going on, this is an inhalation, so they're bringing in another batch of air into that first inhalation. So while the air that we're tracking is leaving the lungs going to the anterior air sacs, the next inhalation cycle is beginning and moving fresh air into the posterior air sacs. And then on expiration 2, this air that's in the anterior air sacs that's full of CO2 and been depleted of its oxygen then leaves the body. And at the same time, in expiration 2, the batch of air that was just behind this one is moving into the lungs. So what this does is it provides a one-way flow of air, so that when the lungs have air in them, it's always maximally oxygenated. Well, once we get this oxygen in the blood, we have to move it to the tissues. So birds have a very efficient circulatory system. The heart is twice the size of comparably sized mammals. It beats faster than comparably sized mammals and at a higher blood pressure. Not only that, but it carries the oxygen more efficiently by having more efficient hemoglobins. The hemoglobins that are produced in the blood can bind more oxygen and deliver more oxygen more efficiently. Otherwise, the heart is very similar to that seen in mammals. It's a 4-chambered heart. One major difference, though, is when we have a left aortic arch, birds have a right aortic arch. Well, with high metabolism comes costs. And one of those costs is high rate of water loss. And here, if we just look at one species, an ostrich, is living in a very dry environment, it's losing a lot of water, and about 1/3 of that loss is due to respiration. So actually breathing in and out loses a lot of that water. And again, if you do gular fluttering, that's going to increase to be an even higher percentage. Relatively little is passed through the skin, and the remaining 2/3 of the water roughly is lost through getting rid of nitrogenous waste and then feces. Well, where do birds get their water? Many of them drink water. So in an ostrich, they actually do have to find water and drink that. They can get some from their food directly by eating wet foods, but then also there's a process in metabolism where you actually produce what is called metabolic water. So if you remember how aerobic metabolism works, there are all these hydrogens that are carrying electrons through various chemical reactions, and they end up bonding to oxygen in the very last phase of aerobic metabolism. That makes metabolic water. Well, remember we talked about the mass-specific metabolism being greater in smaller birds, and so because high metabolism leads to high rates of water loss, this is going to be a much bigger problem for small birds and also birds in hot, dry habitats. But some birds can actually get close to relying completely on metabolically produced water and really don't need much in the way of external water sources. So something like a Gambel's quail that lives in a desert can rely almost entirely on metabolic water production. So as I mentioned, metabolic water is one source of water. Eating wet foods is important in some birds, like fruit. Nectar has a great deal of water in it, and even meat provides a lot of fluids for carnivores. In something that's a nectivorous bird, however, like a hummingbird, you actually have the opposite problem. They have too much water. Remember, birds want to stay relatively wet, so birds that are nectivorous, like hummingbirds, you can actually see them urinating. But again, drinking water is important for some birds, especially granivores that are eating relatively dry foods and have relatively high metabolism and oftentimes living in very dry environments or hot environments. So they have to find sources of water to drink. So not only are you losing a lot of water with high metabolism, but you're generating lots of nitrogenous waste. And so birds have paired kidneys to concentrate and get rid of this nitrogenous waste. At the same time, osmoregulation is going on. So they are selectively resorbing certain salts and other solutes that the body needs while concentrating those nitrogenous wastes and getting them out of the body. And this is typically what a kidney looks like. The paired kidneys kind of look like mirror images running along the backbone of a bird. So here we're seeing it both in a male and a female, and associated testes and ovaries. And we'll be talking about the reproductive anatomy and physiology in birds in the next lecture. So in our last lecture, we talked about the digestive system, and we talked about the importance of the large intestines for resorbing water. Past that, we have the cloaca, and the cloaca is where we see the deposition of urine, where we also can see some additional resorption of water and some salts back into the body that are needed, and the concentration of this uric acid so it can be eliminated from the cloaca with relatively little loss of water. And the last topic I wanted to talk about was the fact that some birds have what are called nasal salt glands. They actually, because of their diet and the environment that they live in, they need to remove excess salts from their blood. So this is particularly important in things like marine feeding birds. So in typical seawater, there's about 3% salt, but you really need only about 1% salt in the blood. And so this gland, which is located supraorbitally, so above the eye, can excrete a 5% salt solution. Now this is a structure that's found in all birds, but it's vestigial in most. You really only see it highly functional in birds that are in the marine environment. So think about gulls, skuas, things like that, penguins. And sometimes if you see a gull on the beach, you will see them with fluid coming out of their nostril. Well, this is excretions from the salt gland. Some people mistakenly think that the bird is sick, but no, this is just a normal function for them, getting rid of that excess salt. So that's the end of this lecture. In the next lecture, again, we will cover reproduction.